A very good morning, afternoon, evening to all the participants, depending on where you're connecting from. I am Nilüfer Sadeghi, Water Resource Specialist and Team Leader at the Asian Development Bank. A warm welcome to you all who have joined us today in Technical Session 4B, Governance and Planning for Climate Resilience. The key question that we will be discussing in our session today is, how might we enhance our institutional governance and planning systems to promote climate resilience? As you know, the impacts of climate change vary by geographic region, and resilience efforts differ considerably across communities and societies. It is the legal, political, and economic systems, and broadly, governance structures that determine how a changing climate will affect people and how people will adapt. Institutions and processes for governance, the planning, allocation, and implementation of public investment are key to success. We have 5 speakers today who will share their insights towards governance and planning systems to promote climate resilience. We also have our young water professional who is the reporter reporting on this session, Ms. Ziyu Yao. She is postdoctoral research fellow at Sun Yat-sen University. Let me remind that you may post your questions in the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen at any time during the session. We will have half an hour Q&A at the end of the presentations. Without any further ado, we will hear the first presentation by Dr. Cindy Priyadi. Dr. Priyadi is assistant professor in University of Indonesia since 2011. Since 2007, she has conducted various research on water, sanitation, and hygiene, or WASH, in the urban context, and water quality in surface as well as groundwater. She has received several national and international research grants and also obtained international funding from the National Geographic Society for community engagement in Indonesia. She has been granted a technology patent, co-founded a tech startup, awarded Best Lecturer in her department, and took up various leader roles. She is currently head of the Environmental Engineering Study Program at Universitas Indonesia. Dr. Priyadi, the floor is yours.
You're right. Thank you very much, Mrs. Nilüfer. My name is Cindy Rianti Priyadi on behalf of my colleagues from Universitas Indonesia, University of Technology Sydney, and UNICEF Indonesia. I am happy to present our findings since 2020, which is entitled From Impacts to Adaptation, Pathways to Climate Resilient Citywide Inclusive Sanitation in 4 Cities, Indonesia. The findings in this study are partly published recently, just in the beginning of the year, so you can look up into that later if you are interested in this study. So as Ms. Nilüfer has presented, introduced in the beginning, so climate change is increasingly the new operating context for delivery of sanitation services. Especially, this is a concern for sanitation because most sanitation facility or infrastructure is located at the low level because they usually use gravity. So it is the most prone to climate hazards, mostly such as sea level rise and flooding. But also we can imagine that drought and strong wind can also impact sanitation. So we conducted a research which spanned from 2020 to 2022. And this was a collaborative research in 4 cities in Indonesia, namely Bekasi, Makassar, and Palu, but we also conducted one in a rural area, which is in Lombok Timur. Each city was chosen for its specific characteristic related to flooding, sea level rise, drought, and strong wind. The study has been published as a report on November 2021 by UNICEF. Okay, so what we found, first of all, is that climate climate change, as we know, cannot be ignored anymore. The evidence of impacts of climate change was already felt by most of the households, and mostly in the level of drought, but also including flood, high sea level, and strong winds. And with these 4 climate hazards, they already sense a lack of toilet access. For example, in flood, they can have lack of access to the toilet because of inundation of the facility or inundation of the surrounding area, limiting access to the sanitation facility. In times of drought, they have inadequate water for flushing and cleaning. And in times of strong winds, it can damage the superstructure and perturb privacy. This can happen from multiple times per month up to multiple times per week. So based on that, we presented the results, and along with other detailed results, and if you're interested, you can go into the report, to the local government of the 4 cities. And with that evidence, we did a risk assessment with them, and also tried to gather their awareness and commitment to address climate change. And so this was all done during the pandemic, so most of the meetings with the local government was done online. We did a participatory risk assessment using simple tools such as Menti to rank which actions are chosen or preferred or prioritized by the local government related to the climate resilient sanitation. We also tried to co-develop other actions with the local government, with implementing the theory of change, where we, using also interactive platforms, decided short-term actions and also long-term actions. And of course, these included not only technical aspects, but also financial, institutional, and other non-technical aspects. The detail of this co-development of adaptation actions is published, as I mentioned in the beginning, in this journal, which you can look up with the first author by Professor Juliet Willits, which is part of this study. We've also developed a climate resilient citywide inclusive sanitation framework, which included 7 aspects. And this was also based on the co-developing, co-design process with the local government, which included risk and vulnerability informed planning and decision making. So this is important because most of the planning, at least in Indonesia, what is happening right now, is only based on present and past conditions and not a future or risk and vulnerability informed planning. So this is what we've tried to introduce in the framework. And the second one is clear institutional responsibility and flexible management and service delivery arrangement, because what we found in the field is that you have agencies responsible for climate on one hand, which is usually the environmental agency, and you have agencies responsible for sanitation on the other hand, which is usually public works or the likes. But when it comes to climate resilient sanitation, which is the mix between the two, then it's not really clear who's responsible for prevention and who's responsible for disaster response. And the third one is sustainable and responsive financing. This is also important because most finance related to disaster is usually finance for disaster response and not for disaster prevention. And the fourth one is robust or repairable sanitation infrastructure options. This is probably more evident. And the fifth one is creative, strength-based user engagement and awareness, for them to realize that flooding or sea level rise, for example, even if it's just a few centimeters, it can already impact sanitation significantly. And then the sixth one is the integration of action on the whole water cycle, because when we talk about sanitation, we also talk about water, we also talk about surface, but also groundwater, and how it relates to the environment and public health. And the seventh one is maintaining capacity for continual adaptation through monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So this is based on the IPCC definition. So as a conclusion, we saw that climate change have significant impacts on urban sanitation services. As we saw, we showed one evidence where there is lack of access to toilet, but actually in the study, we looked further into how it also impacted the containment, the desludging process, and also up to the sludge treatment, and how these are all part of the sanitation service chain, and you can only have a safely managed sanitation if you handle the whole service chain together, and how you make a resilient sanitation not only at the user point of view, but all throughout the sanitation service chain. So on behalf of my colleagues, Juliet Willits, Osha Basta, Ducha Ulandari, Nasim Tias, Nati, Jeremy Collins, Freya Mills, and Maraita Listiasari, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Priyadi. Our next presentation is by Mr. Bill Farger. Bill is a founder and director of Either and a leading global advisor on water policy and management. He has 20 years of professional experience advising on water across the public and private sector, and has advised governments and businesses in Australia, Central and South Asia, the Middle East, and North America. He has led numerous national level dialogues, including Based on Water Guide, which he co-authored as part of Either's contribution to the World Bank and UN High-Level Panel on Water. Before co-founding Either in 2012, he spent 7 years working at Australia's National Water Commission, including 3 years as the general manager. He led the National Water Initiative work programs on rural and urban water, along with assessments of progress in the implementation of national water reforms. Bill is a Churchill Fellow, a member of the Australian Journal of Water Resources editorial panel, and a past member of the expert panel overseeing Australia's National Infrastructure Plan. His presentation today will cover a hard and soft infrastructure for climate resilient water services. Bill, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And can I just confirm that you can see the screen? Aha. Sorry about that. I thought that was done. Okay, great. Sorry for that short interruption, everyone. So yes, as per the introduction, my name is Will Farger. I'm very pleased to join you here today from Canberra. I am a co-founding director of Aether, a specialist water advisory business headquartered here in Australia, but with staff and projects increasingly spanning the globe. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you in this session, focusing on how improved governance and infrastructure investment can enhance water security and respond to water-related risks. So water-related risks, specifically water insecurity, as is well known, threaten the viability and economies of societies and communities across the planet. We know that surface and groundwater supplies in many parts of the world have declined precipitously and are on the verge of collapse in some areas. And water crises are consistently cited by government and business as a top global risk in terms of impact. But unfortunately, the impact of climate change means that this crisis will become increasingly severe. And we are really set for water insecurity to have a significant impact on economic development and public health globally. I'll be intentionally brief in describing the dimensions of the water security crisis because I know the challenges are well documented and that many of these facts and figures will be familiar to you. We know that for good reason, the Sustainable Development Goal 6 focuses on water security, that the UN initiated the Decade of Action on Water in 2018, and why a large majority of countries see water management as a priority in their climate adaptation plans. But despite this focus, progress against our goals is very much lagging. The UN summary report on SDG 6 progress states that even before COVID struck, the world was off track to meet this goal, that the current rates of progress need to quadruple in order to reach the global target of universal access by 2030, and that no SDG region is on track to achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. So this is a pretty alarming lack of progress against what are very well recognised and almost universally accepted goals. Now, many reasons are offered to explain this poor progress, and I just wanted to take the chance to reflect on AIFA's work globally and where we see the problem lying. And there are three main areas that I want to highlight here. The first being a lack of clear objectives and clearly articulated strategies in response. Do we really know what we're targeting for at a level of specificity that allows us to implement actionable plans? Second, fragmented institutions and a complexity of players. This obscures lines of decision-making, roles and responsibilities, and accountability. And finally, inadequate cost recovery and incentives, which impedes attempts to better attract and direct capital, address issues like non-revenue water, improve coverage and service delivery, and frankly, achieve a financially viable water sector. Now, these challenges, I'd argue, are inherently governance problems. And by governance, I mean laws, regulations, rules, policies, and institutions which are supported or introduced in support of the outcomes which we seek. So that's a broad definition of governance. We all know we need water infrastructure, but what we too often fail to recognise is that without governance reform, infrastructure alone will fail to achieve genuine water security. Indeed, poor governance was identified in a recent survey of global water sector leaders as the primary reason for them considering that tackling water insecurity was either challenging or impossible. So how do we proceed in a way that can improve both governance and infrastructure if they are both an essential part of the solution? And Australia's response to scarcity through governance reform and improvements to infrastructure investment and use may offer some insights and lessons to this. So Australia has long faced the drivers of water scarcity, which are increasingly presenting themselves across the globe. Our naturally dry and variable climate is becoming more so, with extremes of flood and drought occurring against a backdrop of drying overall. And in addition to increased scarcity and variability, like many other parts of the world, Australia also faces challenges balancing growing and competing demands for available water resources. So wholesale reforms of Australia's approach to water governance and infrastructure have been undertaken in this context. We have, over the last 2 decades, worked hard to define clear objectives for managing water, to overhaul approaches to water planning, pricing, entitlements, utility ownership, regulation, and markets, to invest in infrastructure to secure supply, and there have had to be significant investments made in hard infrastructure, and to introduce performance monitoring and reporting frameworks. Now, while progress can be slow and variable, there's no magic wands or silver bullets, and certainly more work still needs to be done in Australia. The net effect has been positive, enhancing water security through more sustainable water use, more efficient service delivery, and improved cost recovery, including through utility and regulatory reform, more certainty for investors and operators, improved investment decisions resulting from better economic appraisal, and more publicly available information on performance and transparency. So if we just step quickly through each of these lessons in turn. First, we say that it's critical to have the means to get everyone on the same page and to define practical roadmaps for improvement. Australia's benefited from an explicit focus on economic efficiency and environmental sustainability in our engagement with roadmaps for reform. Enshrining these principles in national reform agreements was instrumental in bringing stakeholders into the debate, achieving consensus on the detail of reforms, and maintaining commitment to long-term improvement. Australia's experience also shows the role of improved governance in supporting economically efficient and financially sustainable infrastructure outcomes. So from splitting policy and service delivery functions to corporatizing utilities and introducing independent economic regulation, governance changes have been instrumental to changing our approach to infrastructure planning and delivery. And in turn, infrastructure investments can also be strategically linked to improvements in governance and policy reforms. So instances of smart infrastructure investment being linked to governance reforms has been central to achieving incremental progress in Australia. We also need to think about building the capability for next generation water management. And so improved economics, policy and strategy, we would argue, is a critical part of responding to water scarcity. And for this, the sector requires learning new languages and approaches. Water management is no longer the exclusive domain of engineers. The future lies in committing resources to build and integrate the necessary broad capability and capacity to run with new agendas. And a major change we have seen relates to the incorporation of economics into water sector decision making. While very beneficial, there's generally still a low level of literacy in water agencies when it comes to the use of economic tools. And supporting the adoption of these approaches will raise the quality of decisions made over time. So to conclude, we would argue that our response globally to water scarcity will define both the impact of climate change and the success of economies and societies around the world. We can't overstate the importance of responding to this challenge. There is an urgent need to scale up action, and it should be clear that getting governance and infrastructure right is at the core of the required response. Our strong view is that we must recognise governance as an integral part of water infrastructure to deliver water security. Recognising that governance precedes and shapes any decision to build physical infrastructure, it guides the nature and timing of any development, and it supports the effectiveness and extends the life of physical assets long after they are built. So just like built infrastructure, governance itself requires planning, design, and integration across many disciplines. It requires effective operation and maintenance and investment in capability to deliver. So perhaps if we started treating governance as such, rather than a side issue to be considered perhaps after the event, it'd finally get the attention that it deserves and would begin to reap the benefit of better decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. The next presentation is by Dr. Mark Maimoni. Dr. Maimoni is Senior Vice President at CDM Smith, which is a global privately owned engineering and construction firm. Dr. Maimoni is a senior modeling expert and water resource management specialist with over 37 years of experience in groundwater and surface water studies, source water protection and stormwater studies, water quality studies, mathematical modeling of ground and surface water, and climate change adaptation. For over 8 years, he worked with the Philadelphia Water Department, or PWD, developing innovative approaches and tools for actionable climate change adaptation, leading to the development of climate change design guidelines for PWD, water, wastewater assets, and properties. The design and planning guidance is being used to assess PWD's risk of flooding and incorporate projected climate change impacts in future design to increase resiliency. The program includes an analysis of sea level rise over the past 100 years in Philadelphia, development of probabilities for extreme storm surges, a changing flood frequency tool, and a vulnerability assessment of PWD assets. His presentation today will cover climate change and precipitation, the challenge of extreme rainfall and flooding. Dr. Maimoni, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. As we just heard, I will focus on tools in my short presentation here. Tools that will help us to look at extreme rainfall. Now, we've seen already in the prior presentations, climate change is no longer just a future concern. It really is here and now. These pictures are taken from various places around the world, but I could add today, Seoul, South Korea, These are tragedies. These are extreme rainfall events that are causing loss of life, an enormous amount of property damage, and so forth. We need to recognize the impacts are here. We need to recognize that they are significant. They are everywhere. And we must design both for existing and future conditions. The World Bank just came out with a staggering statistic that said 1.8 billion, with a B, people apparently live in a place that is subject to a 100-year return interval flood. And as I'm going to show you, that 100-year return interval is likely to be even more frequent today because we tend to be underestimating these risks around the world. How do we project extreme storm intensification? This is not easy. It's a highly complex problem. We have to rely on global regional climate models. That's all we have to look into the future at this particular point. But unfortunately, they're not very accurate for precipitation, and they're even less accurate for extreme events. There's a lot of research, incredible research going on around the world to try to untangle this problem and give us better estimates. Some of them look at the global climate model parameters, disentangle them, look at trends associated with that, do statistical analyses, and attempt to then recreate storm intensities in the future. There are also convective permitting models, regional models that are more finely grained that can take a look at some of these extreme storms in a better sense. But the bottom line is they're still underestimating quite significantly. Now, communities around the world can't spend the money or the time on these studies. We need these studies to go on to enhance our understanding, but we need practical research-based estimates for use now in our planning and design. So there are a couple of ways of looking at this. If we go back to the research and the most recent research, a lot of people are pointing out that the holding capacity of water increases by about 7% per degree Celsius increase in temperature. This is called the Clausius-Clapeyron principle. It's well known. But the most recent research actually is indicating that this may be the bottom end of it, and that for these short duration or low probability storms, these are two principles that are being firmly entrenched now in the research. This increase could be up to 14% per degree Celsius. This will depend a lot on topography, climate, local climate, and urban degree of urbanization. There are a lot of factors associated with it, but the 7% might not be as little as it can be. Having said all of that, this is an enormously challenging problem. There is no single answer, and looking for that single answer is going to put us into an endless do loop. So what we really need are practical, actionable methods. And I'm going to suggest three that can help us bracket this problem of estimating extreme rainfall intensification. I call them the low, the middle, and the high estimate. The first one is based using global climate model daily rainfall output because it's readily available around the world. The second and third shift the estimates to temperature trends, which these models are much better at estimating. And they use the Clausius-Clapeyron principles, or the super ones, to make these estimates. I'll show you that in a second. The graph on the right is simply an application that we did in which we actually tracked the climate change shift in a particular storm intensity. You can see on the bottom the return interval in years, and on the vertical axis is simply the intensity of that particular duration storm. I'm making a point here that there is a significant shift upwards due to climate change going forward at the end of the century. But the natural variability of these events is even greater, and that has to be considered as well, but that is probably a subject for a different talk. So let me look at these three estimating procedures because they are applicable almost anywhere, and they're not all that hard to do. The first one we actually applied to the entire United States. We took all 32 global climate models. The United States is broken up into 202 watersheds covering the contiguous United States. That is over 300,000 grid cells. It was a massive data undertaking. But basically what we did here is we used all the global climate models. We chose a reference period. In this case, it was 1986 to 2005. And the idea here was to take the largest daily rainfalls for all of those models in 20-year chunks, first in the reference period and then decade by decade through the end of century. And using these 20 largest, we could average them all out and calculate what we call delta change factors. These are simply multipliers of the intensities of storms in the reference period. And once we've done that, you can see on the right, we simply did it graphically for the United States. On the top left, it's 2020. On the bottom right, it's 2090. A couple of things jump out at you. One, that deep red actually indicates that extreme storm events will intensify by over 50%. And you will begin to see these kinds of intensifications by mid-century in parts of the country, and by the end of century, fully a third of the country will be seeing these. But everywhere in the United States, intensifying storms by end of century might be anywhere from 20 to 60%. The second estimate, we moved to temperature, because as I mentioned before, the global climate models are actually quite good at estimating future temperatures and reading and matching the past. So this is a simple application of the Clausius-Clapeyron. What we did here was we selected a series of models. We took, again, these 20-year periods, a reference period, and then decade by decade, 20-year chunks in a moving average. And we simply calculated the increase in temperature that these models were calculating. You can see that in the column here, resulting in this particular case in Philadelphia for a 6-degree Celsius increase by end of century. And then just applying the Clausius-Clapeyron, 7% times the temperature increase, you end up with an estimate of about 42% by end of century for these extreme storms. Again, quite a significant increase. The last estimate is a little bit more complex. And here we're attempting to take a look at this concept of super Clausius-Clapeyron and actually using the two principles that I mentioned earlier. One is that for these very short duration, maybe a 60-minute intense storm event, we can see increases of up to 14% for these very, very extreme storms that are infrequent. And then we have the 7% at the other end of the scale. And so what we've done here simply is we have various duration storms, 60 through 48 hours. And here, just illustrative of 3 different return intervals, 10-year, 50-year, and 100-year. And we apply these principles so that you'll see that the shorter duration ones are getting greater delta change factors or intensification factors, and the longer ones are smaller ones. And if you move all the way to the 100-year shortest duration, you're getting the greatest intensification factors. And these are based on temperature again. And you interpolate in between. And therefore, you can actually take a look at all of the storms and all of the durations and the various return intervals and project what's going on in the future. Just a simple showing of how this worked out here. All I did was take all of the durations and lump them into an average so we can actually see what's going on. And the color coding is the low or 20 storm method. The 7% Clausius-Clapeyron or mid-estimate method is the 10. And the red is the 7 to 14th or the super Clausius-Clapeyron by duration and return interval. And you can see in this particular case, this is again Philadelphia, that what we are calling the 100-year return interval storm from all of these durations actually might be as low as 80 to 55% year return interval currently, because we've already experienced climate change. And by the end of century, in the high end, we could see those 100-year return intervals down as low as 10, which means there's a 10% chance of these extreme events occurring in Philadelphia each year. This graph I'm not going to spend much time on, but it's the same information, just disaggregated by duration, same color scheme, same thing. Across the bottom is our decades, and across the top are the return intervals. And simply, this is illustrating that each duration actually responds a little bit differently, and this approach will handle that as well. So, a couple of key takeaways. Clearly, intensification of extreme storms has occurred and will continue to occur going forward. We are generally underestimating this with tragic consequences, even for current conditions. The models are not good and are also underestimating intensification, so we have to use them in certain ways to actually make these estimates more accurate. These two principles are important to keep in mind. Low probability storms and shorter duration are likely to intensify more and faster than the higher probability storms and the longer ones. We still can't make accurate precisions, so I'm suggesting that we have some of these simple techniques that we can apply to help our planning and design and bracket these estimates to avoid some of the tragedies that we've been seeing on a weekly basis. I assume the questions will be done at the end, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maimoni. The next presentation is by Mr. Ismail Weiliang, who is a water engineer at Mott MacDonald, Singapore. Ismail is a water engineer delivering water resilience through digital, innovative, and sustainable solutions for the critical challenges of water security and flood risk management, and especially focusing in East Asia. He works on local and overseas flood risk management and supports the proposal development, deployment of digital twin solutions, and digital transformation for East Asia's water sector. His presentation today will cover delivering smart flood management in Bangkok. Ismail, the floor is yours.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Thank you. All right, let me start. Hi everyone, thank you to ADB for giving us the privilege to share, and everyone online for lending your ears to listen to this pertinent topic of climate change and water-related risk. Good morning from Singapore. My name is Ismail Weiliang. I'm a water engineer at Mott MacDonald, Singapore, and today I'll be sharing an exciting project that we developed from 2020, and it's in operation this year, delivering smart flood management in Bangkok. So I'll share a little on Bangkok. There's intense, highly localized tropical rainfall events causing frequent stormwater flooding in Bangkok. This causes traffic disruptions, damage to property and infrastructure, resulting in economic, health, and social issues, which disproportionately affect the most vulnerable in society. The high spatial and temporal variability of these storm events is a challenge for accurately predicting it globally, and operational response from the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, BMA, is reactive without time to prepare and respond effectively. So with climate change, population growth, and urbanization, it's increasing the frequency and severity of these storm water flooding events, and Bangkok needs to increase its resilience. So what if we could accurately predict rainfall and flooding, whether in Bangkok or globally? So we have developed a global first real-time surface water flood forecasting decision support system to basically it accurately predicts where, when, and how much rainfall and flooding will occur. And this will allow city authorities to respond better to flashy floods that are increasing in frequency and intensity with climate change. So Bangkok current flood management has data and stakeholders segregated, and we have integrated this into Mott MacDonald's digital twin platform, Moata. It provides a single source of truth for all stakeholders, enabling better communication and efficient decision making before and after and during flood events. We did rainfall radar improvements through VPR, vertical profiling radar, with continuous calibration and automatic rainfall maps with 2-hour nowcasting. So a world-class quantitative precipitation estimate QP and 2-hour rainfall nowcasting system was developed with an automated workflow behind to generate rainfall maps and animations across the city. So you can see in the picture there, you can access different types of information from the platform itself. So for traditional flood modeling, we have the rainfall and conditions as an input with calibration and validation of past events using a simulation software. Results are produced sequentially where information propagates, but so do errors. And this takes quite a long period of time as well. So we have applied machine learning to the flood model to produce a surrogate model which converts rainfall nowcasts into flood maps within seconds. So the machine learning surrogate model is a global first and is calibrated with a hydraulic flood model. It delivers flood predictions in 1 second with a relative confidence of 2 cm and outputs every 10 minutes. So you can see the predicted and the target here. It's close. So we have integrated all this observed data and forecast information in a visual user-friendly interface and provided flood alerts to trigger operational response. So this single source of truth is provided for all the stakeholders, enabling better communication and efficient decision making. This is a summary slide for the outputs for our flood management decision support system that we have delivered. Real-time data feeds has been integrated from Bangkok authorities. The 2-hour rainfall nowcast across the city is with 500-meter resolution and 10 minutes update. This outperforms the standard 8 km resolution and 2-hour updates. Innovation machine learning application enables this 2-hour flood forecast with 2-meter resolution and 10-minute updates for real-time operation. So this was previously considered impossible with conventional hydraulic modeling. There is also automatic post-events reporting compared to the current manual analysis. To conclude, with flood management decision support systems, it will enable city authorities to see the unseen with real-time flood insights from the forecasting. This will enable them to act with conviction by shifting flood response from reactive to proactive, and this impacts progress for their TOTEX, their operations, planning and investment for flood risk management. So our decision support system is powered by our digital twin Moata, and it's modularly designed and integrable with additional data feeds, analytics, and systems such as SCADA for operational control or other digital twins for economic, environmental, and social outcomes, opening countless cross-sectoral possibilities in the future. So that is all. Thank you, everyone. This project wouldn't be possible with our global team for project management, social outcomes, flood risk, emergency response, and digital twin, digital team, and the Weather Radar New Zealand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ismail. Our final presentation today is by Dr. Daniel Goodwin, who is a research fellow at Cranfield University. Dr. Goodwin holds a Bachelor of Engineering in Environmental Engineering from Griffith University, Australia, as well as a Master of Science in Architecture, Environment and Energy Studies from the University of East London. Daniel completed his engineering doctorate at Cranfield University as part of the STREAM Industrial Doctorate Center on the topic of stakeholder perceptions of water reuse in the context of scheme design and governance. Daniel is currently working across a number of research projects on topics including the role of water-sensitive industrial symbiosis in a circular economy, adaptive capacity and resilience in agriculture, and integrated energy strategies for urban decarbonization. His presentation today will cover the contribution of drought communication and advice networks to agricultural drought adaptation in northern Thailand. Dr. Goodwin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Niloufar. Thank you to the ADB, and thank you to the speakers so far, Cindy, Mark, Will, and Ismail. I'm Daniel Goodwin from Cranfield University Water Institute, and the title of my talk today is the contribution of drought communication and advice networks to agricultural drought adaptation in northern Thailand. So linking through from the previous talk about flood management in Thailand. So the project, I'll be presenting the results from some research that was undertaken as part of a project called STAR, and STAR was Strengthening Thailand's Agricultural Drought Resilience. And so STAR, Cranfield University was part of consortium where we've worked alongside the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, Chiang Mai University, King Mongkut University, and Chulalongkorn University. So the overall aims of the research was to look at understanding drought impacts and assessing farmers' adaptive capacity in a case study region in northwest Thailand, strengthening resilience through improving communications of drought risks. These were the aims of the research project. This research presented today as a small portion of the overall project, which was much broader. The research questions, in brief, was to look at how institutional communications influence farmers' motivations and actions to act against drought, to understand a little bit more about the characteristics of the information and how they're influencing farmers' adaptations, and then to look at how the networks of communications between farmers and institutions, how effective the communications are and how they might be improved. So a little bit about the methods, background to the study. We're working in the Ping catchment, as I mentioned, in northwest Thailand. We interviewed farmers back in January 2020, pre-pandemic, across these 4 provinces. The farmers were interviewed. We had 176 data points there across the 12 districts in the Ping catchment. The Ping catchment is a tributary of the larger Chao Phraya River, flowing out into Bangkok, causing flooding issues at times. The farmers were recruited through the villages, through the village head persons, and they were interviewed by student researchers in the field. So just a brief overview of what the survey respondents looked like. I won't go into too much detail about this. We had sort of a mix of balance of male and female respondents across the different provinces. It varied by province, age as well, varying across the provinces. Overall, most farmers were aged between 40 and 59 years of age. We asked the farmers what their production types were. As you'd expect, most were growing rice and fruit, longan, mango, keeping animals, and also longer season crops, cassava, short season crops, corn, etc. Main sources of waters were canals, followed by wells and rivers and farm ponds. So we asked about adaptations and what farmers had been doing in response to droughts in the past. And most of the farmers said that in the past they had changed something. And they also thought that most of the adaptations they had undertaken, most of them had been effective to some degree. So the figure on the right of your screen, you'll see we just categorised the different adaptations that the farmers were undertaking. So some relating to water supply, enhancing their water supplies, some around farm management, changing in cultivation, and so on, income adaptations and animal-based adaptations, which might have been culling animals, selling animals, and so on. The farmers told us that they did perceive worsening impacts of drought. So although it's a high rainfall area, periodic droughts is also an issue in the region, particularly driven by El Nino, Southern Oscillation. Farmers are perceiving worsening impacts, but we asked them what they could do, how they could adapt to it. And one of the main constraints, or 2 main constraints, was not having enough money and not having enough information about what to do. So here a high proportion in the green bars said they just didn't have enough money to make the changes to adapt to climate change and drought specifically for this research. We also looked at protection motivation. So we've talked a bit about in the previous presentations about understanding climate systems and modeling climate systems, but also we're interested in understanding behavior. And it's quite challenging to predict human behavior and what humans might do. So in the research, we're looking at how farmers appraised their risk and how they appraised their adaptation, their self-efficacy and their response efficacy, and also response cost, which informed whether they acted or not. So this just shows some of the results of the protection motivation analysis in terms of behavioural responses, whether they changed something or not, the risk appraisal and the adaptation appraisal. So we found driving adaptation appraisal, a green arrow indicating a positive association, was that if they had perceived successful adaptations in the past, they were more likely to have a higher perception of their adaptation, and also whether they desired further adaptations also influenced whether they were inclined to undertake more adaptations in the future. In terms of communications, institutional drought communications influenced the desire for future adaptations and that appraisal of their ability to be able to adapt, and also whether they had adapted or not in the past. There was some negative associations as well, associated with the types of communications, the timing, the format, and the relevance or the perceived relevance. Farmer-to-farmer communications as well, where farmers had received more communications from other farmers, they were more likely to perceive a higher risk of drought, which also influenced their behavioural response. Within all of this, there was interconnected factors and a strong feedback. So particularly around the perceived successful adaptations, where adaptations had been perceived to be successful, that drove the perception of the benefits of future adaptations. We asked them about the information they'd received and whether that had influenced them to make changes in response to drought. Most of the farmers said they had received information, 91%, but only 50% had changed something. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons behind why they may or may not have changed something. They may have already adapted, and in which case did not have a need to change something on their farm. But there is an implication that information plays a role in influencing farmers in terms of what they do. So in this catchment, most farmers are receiving communications locally at village meetings from the village head person. But they also said that the information coming from the national government, information about drought management and what to do in situations of drought, they perceive that as more efficacious than the local farmer communications. Okay, we modelled the advice networks. So there's a lot of detail in here. The overall message is that it matters, or it mattered in this case in particular, in terms of how farmers were connected. So we used social network analysis to sort of diagnose the status of communications within the catchment relating to drought, and then to understand how the network was interconnected, the degree to which that might be influencing farmers to adapt. From this analysis, this social network analysis, the main conclusion was, it was quite obvious, perhaps, that the more connected farmers were, the more likely they were to have adapted to drought, in the past. So I know I've skipped through quite a lot of information there fairly quickly. In summary, from this research, very case-based, so in terms of generalization, it's difficult to say how much we can generalize from these local surveys. But with the farmers we spoke to, there's the desire for preparedness, but a lot of the farmers are saying they're constrained by wealth in particular. They don't have the money to invest in adaptation or knowledge and information about what they should do and when. There are low and no regret interventions that can help improve preparedness and resilience. So in the case of this research, we were focused on the social networks and the characteristics of communication. These are things that can be easily done to influence what farmers and local management, but also governments as well, are doing to prepare for drought. There's some evidence from our research to suggest that strengthening advice networks, connecting local knowledge and practices into policy, that the social network provides a benefit to that. So the social networks, in terms of how farmers are connected, is also drawing together the local knowledge and practice of farmers and tying that more into the policy. We identified a capacity for local actors to bridge information bottlenecks in the network. So there's a complex network of actors, and within that network, there's constraints that need to be overcome to help the network function. And there's opportunities for institutions to enhance their dissemination of information, in particular to reach the less networked farmers. So finally, there's benefits to framing drought communications in terms of the efficacy and attainability of suitable adaptations. So tell farmers what they can do, how and when they should do it, rather than appealing to fears about the risk of drought or flooding. So it's not just droughts, it's climate variability and flooding. So in terms of social networks and tying together transmissions of information, there's benefits beyond drought communications and more broadly to informing what farmers and local communities can do in response to climate change. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Daniel, and thanks very much to all of our excellent speakers who shared their knowledge and insights with us today. Now we will be having our question and answer session. We've already received a few questions, but please, if there are any further questions, do type them on the Q&A panel at the right side of your screen. So the first question is for Dr. Priadi. It's about, the audience would like to hear more about the drought challenges that you mentioned in one of the slides. For example, during drought, there is a lack of water for flushing. So would you please elaborate more on the challenges that you face?
Yes. So this is how a demonstration of how water and sanitation is very closely related. So we investigated the impact of drought in the sanitation service chain, and starting from the toilet, we can see that there's when drought comes, water is inaccessible, and so the households have difficulty to flush. But then on the other hand, it's not that easy to introduce, for example, waterless toilet, because the culture in Indonesia is actually not only using water for flushing, but also using water for cleaning. So this impact of drought has two sides, because there's no water for flushing. So they use other toilets, and we found that around 73% actually converted or slipped back to open defecation. So this is stopping the progress of the SDG. They have water given for their daily domestic use, but it's not enough for sanitation use. Over to you, Ms. Nilufar.
Thank you, Dr. Priadi. Our next question is for Dr. Maimoni. It's about the computing power and data availability needed to produce the watershed map that you had done for all the watersheds in the United States. So what is the computer that would be required? Would an ordinary computer in one of the ministries and ADB member countries, would that suffice? Or is a more sophisticated computer technology is needed? And then also, what type of data would be required to produce such a map?
Yes, for the United States, I mean, we did it at our company for a government agency, but for a computing effort of that size, we actually had to rent time on a supercomputer, both for the interim files that we were producing as well as the computing itself. There was no way to do that on standard computers. And there are plenty of companies that will offer these kinds of services for a fee, which turned out actually, for me, I'm not actually an expert in that area, surprisingly low. So yes, you need to rent time on a computer to do it of this scale. But the technique itself, I mean, the fact that we did it for the entire United States was because a government agency was needing this estimate. But the technique itself, whether it's the low or the medium or the high estimate, are specifically designed for any community to do with readily available downloadable data and simple spreadsheets. So our intent is to make these approaches practically available to just about any community. Obviously some communities will have more funds and perhaps can do a more larger scale study, either with convective permitting models or other statistical methods. But we have actually taken this method and benchmarked it against a number of other government agency estimates and found that we were both bracketing and right in the middle of the estimates that were done by much more sophisticated statistical attempts and the use of regional models. So we're quite happy with this approach as a very practical measure for most. Your second part of the question, I'm sorry, I lost the second part of your question. What was it?
What type of data would you need?
Okay, yes, it is all readily available. We're taking daily precipitation. For the United States, we were actually making a distinction between the change factors based on precipitation and change factors based on runoff. Runoff change factors tend to be higher than precipitation ones. So if the precipitation is going up by 40%, you might see runoff increasing by 60, 70%. So that distinction is very important. In the US, we happen to have runoff models for every grid cell from the precipitation global climate model. So we could use those directly. If you don't have that, then you're probably going to have to rely on the precipitation ones. We've come up with other ways of doing that, where you simply take that and apply a simple, either a rational method or a curve method to estimate the runoff and then calculate your DCFs. But basically, the publicly available global climate change output that the IPCC is putting out is all you need for these approaches.
Thank you, Dr. Maimoni. Our next question is for Ismail. So how do you, for flood management, how do you decide the design return periods for different types of structures?
Okay, so it's all about risk. So, but basically that there needs to be a judgment call on what level of risk is acceptable relative to the impact. So for critical infrastructure, we have higher design return periods. And the most important thing is that when the design return periods, when we are designing it, climate change allowances are being built in. So we should also be looking at like adaptive planning where possible, designing in such a way that we can adapt to an uncertain future. The value of this adaptation planning is helping decision makers find a way through the uncertainty around the climate impacts, which can be debilitating for investment decisions. So not all decisions can be made now, but they can be planned, prioritized, and prepared for. So our system, the flood management decision support system, also allows for that, where you plan, prioritize, and prepare for flood impacts 2 hours in advance. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is for Daniel. So while you were observing that the farmers did adopt some adaptation measures, did the farmers change their agricultural cropping patterns to manage droughts? And did the dissemination of information resulted in any change in the cropping patterns?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you. The research we've looked at is retrospective. So we asked farmers about what they've done in the past to change, but we don't have the information to say if you give this type of information, then it changes the cropping patterns, or we don't have that level of detail, but it'd be an interesting follow-up study, I think.
Okay, thank you. So if there are any further questions, please do ask while we continue. The next question is for Bill Farger. It's about the experience shared from Australia. When governance reforms were being examined, what were the main institutional barriers that were identified as hindering bottlenecks to the adaptation process that actually caused the results? So they would like to know more about once you were reviewing the existing structures, the governance structures, what were the problems that you identified and how were they addressed?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question, and the answer, to do justice to it, could take a very long time. But I'll take some examples, because we had lots of problems, and there were very many institutional barriers to unpick. But at a couple of different scales, clearly the adaptation or transition challenge that we have been through has necessitated the transfer or reallocation of scarce water resources within agriculture from lower value to higher value uses and users, and also looked at reallocating water or transferring water in some cases between agriculture and urban areas. And so clearly everyone will appreciate the challenges of looking to allocate and reallocate rights between different users and overcoming the entrenched concerns of the kind of incumbent users, their industries and their communities as we manage transition. And this is going to be something that we see globally as we look to try and best manage and allocate scarce water resources. So what we've had to do is approach this not as a technical water challenge, but as more of a social and political reform. And this is about transforming communities and their economies. So existing right holders have had to be recognised, their rights have had to be valued, and we've had to have means in place to fairly and equitably compensate them, either through co-investing in infrastructure, where water savings could be generated and shared between, for example, existing irrigators and urban areas. So government would invest in infrastructure and then look to share the savings from improvements in, say, the reduction of evaporation and leakage through transmission systems that may have been open channel and then were piped. We have introduced economic mechanisms whereby through the establishment of markets and legally enshrinable entitlements, individual right holders' rights have been recognised and valued, but then a mechanism has been put in place to allow the government to purchase water from willing sellers and manage a compensation process that way. So there are very many different mechanisms in play. The question really is whether there is the political appetite to manage these transitions. And if there is the political appetite, do we have the means available to embrace this as a structural, social and economic reform? If we do, then we're halfway through the challenge, and then we can deploy the technical means that engage the depth and skill of the water sector. But we really need those higher order governance questions dealt with to create an enabling environment to deploy these types of detailed solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting experience from Australia, and I'm sure that many of the ADB member countries can benefit from this experience. And a lot of reforms are underway, but definitely more will be needed, especially given the impacts of climate change, which is seen and felt more and more every day. Question for Dr. Priadi is about the successful resilience building to the impacts of climate change, which requires significant shifts in how various sectors of society, government, the private sector, community groups, and many others interact with each other at multiple levels of government, from the local to the national. How did you manage to bring together the different stakeholders to work together on the citywide sanitation framework and adaptation actions? So it's more about how the different parts of the government as well as the private sector came together to prepare this plan and of course to commit in implementing it.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Niloufar. Yeah, this is a challenge, and I think noting what Will presented on governance. So this is part of the governance of a climate resilient sanitation. And so we've tried to implement a holistic governance in another city, in Banjarmasin, which is currently very impacted by sea level rise. And we see that there are several levels of governance, of course, as we know, but there's a top-down approach because currently the planning for sanitation uses a framework that is developed by the national government. So if we want climate resilient sanitation planning, then it actually needs to come from the national government. So first of all, we need to influence at the level of national government, both the technical ministry and also related to the health and climate ministry. And then there's also a bottom-up governance by the service providers as well as by the households. We have, how do you call it? Community-based sanitation management groups. So for this kind of intervention, it's relatively easy because there's already community involved for that. But for the moment, we feel that there's not enough traction from the service providers, because in the end, once the household agrees to construct climate resilient sanitation along with the system involved, we first, of course, need to involve the service providers, especially the people who construct the toilets, the septic tanks, to adhere to a climate resilient standard. And at the moment, we don't have associations for these septic tanks constructors and related sanitation service providers throughout the sanitation service chain. So we feel that that is the gap we need to address. And then we come together with this community-based sanitation management along with the local government. It's usually led in Indonesia's case by the head of Pokja Sanitasi. So there's a sanitation working group which involves all the different local government agencies involved in sanitation. And then there's a bottom-up approach to ask for the funding. So that's currently how it works, but we feel that the gap with the service provider needs to be addressed in the future. Back to you, Ms. Nilufar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Priadi. Indeed, this is a very challenging issue to bring together different stakeholders. I believe Will has also some insights on the issue, which I hand over to Will to please share your own insights on this with us.
Yeah, thank you. It was just further to that question around experience in institutional coordination and dialogues between ministries and stakeholders. And part of the reflection that we have seen is, and I mentioned this in my notes, is the value in having national or subnational strategies that are developed in a robust way and that include the relevant stakeholders in the generation of clear strategic objectives or outcomes. And if we can be on the same page with respect to what we're trying to achieve, if that can be defined in a way that is respectful of and incorporating the different perspectives, starting points, and aspirations of the relevant stakeholders, and if that can then have the political and institutional weight that comes from being endorsed at a national or subnational level, so that there's that imprimatur for driving implementation, for interagency coordination, for the commitment of the necessary resources required to fund and support this, then that's where, in our experience working in multiple countries, we'd see there being good examples of that. The specific case from Australia is in the agreement to a national water initiative. So back in 2004, all of the Australian governments at a state and federal level came together at a First Ministers roundtable, so with the Prime Minister and Chief Ministers or Premiers of each of the states, and agreed on a national blueprint for water reform in Australia that would cover urban, rural, environmental water reform. And that really laid out a shared national commitment to implementation of reforms that would take us towards commonly viewed objectives. So that process, I think, is not without its own challenges. It is sometimes a question of compromise and trade-offs, as any political negotiation can be. But once in place, we have had that true north that individual governments have been able to be pulled back to, that water agencies within those governments have been able to point to and remind their ministers of the commitments that have been made. And it's really been an effective vehicle for driving action over the last couple of decades. And Australia is now, with a new government in place, in the process of revisiting the concept of a new national water initiative to refresh and reset that direction, because clearly this work is never done. But certainly as a discipline to hold governments and agencies within the governments to account, to coordinate, and for stakeholders to be able to see their objectives reflected in an agreement, then that type of organisation and vehicle seems to be quite effective, and we've seen it repeated elsewhere globally.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you. And I would like to also invite Daniel and then further Mark to also reflect on this. Daniel, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Just a brief point really on institutional coordination, and I don't have any concrete solutions like Will has perhaps offered, but sort of drawing together some of the points that Cindy and Will have just made and relating that to our research project, particularly around social network analysis. So the nature of governance is inherently complex. and where you have the top-down and bottom-up governance approaches, as Cindy was touching on. Farmers or communities perhaps have their own approaches to how they want to do things, and the institutional advice or policy might be pushing in a slightly different direction. So the social network analysis we found as a useful diagnostic more than anything to be able to see where the gaps are or where there's overlap. So one thing farmers were telling us in our research was they didn't know always what to do, or they were receiving conflicting information. So there's some fragmentation in the institutional governance, the coordination, in that there's gaps that could be filled by through better coordination, but also there's that sort of overlapping institutional roles where a space is perhaps over-governed or overfilled by too many actors. So there you get confusion and conflicting advice about what to do. You should do this or you should do that. So yeah, no answers, but being able to visualize and map out who the actors are, where the gaps are, where the bottlenecks are, is one approach that can help understand how that governance system is structured and how it's functioning. And from that, with monitoring, evaluation, and sort of ongoing interventions, you can bring it together more tightly, perhaps, and make some improvements to the institutional and the overall coordination.
Thank you, Daniel. If I may also add to that, that it's not only the government players that are often fragmented and quite a many working in parallel. We have noticed that there are also quite a lot of international institutions that sometimes they are also giving conflicting advice to farmers or to other groups. So the stakeholder mapping is a wonderful advice, and it may be also required to reach out to further players, not only to governmental institutions. So Mark, can you also please reflect on this and share your views with us?
Yeah, I found it interesting, the concept of a top-down or a bottom-up approach. I obviously we need both, and I think, Will, you're focusing a lot on the top-down, which is incredibly important. But a lot of these measures occur on a municipal level, certainly in many areas of the world, and they are their own many complexities as well. So if I reflect on cities in the United States where, for example, they are responding to climate change actively, the first thing you see is that cities that have had a disaster move much more quickly. And it's a lot harder to convince the powers that be to act without a disaster having been in their recent future. And unfortunately, I say recent because the long-term memory of politicians is notoriously short. So you'll see a city like New York City, which has had a huge flooding event. I showed you the picture in one of my opening slides recently, is acting very, very aggressively on issues of flooding and heat and so forth. I work a lot in Philadelphia as well, where they have not had quite the same disaster. The approach there has been quite different. We get a little bit of top-down directive from the states and from the federal government. Basically, what the water department has decided to do was to set up a climate change adaptation program within their service area, and they do water, wastewater, and drinking water. So they have the entire water cycle in their controls. They set up a specific climate adaptation program within the water department. The idea being, because they haven't had a disaster, what this group is designed to do is to develop projections and information that they can then pass upwards. And that's part of why I presented on tools, because a lot of our work has been to do that. The idea being to try to show the city what kinds of problems are going to happen sooner or later, and probably sooner is the operative word. The problem then, of course, becomes both political, where they don't want to move unless they've had the disaster. And two, this group is within the water department, but the solutions invariably include a whole bunch of other departments and actors, whether it's non-governmental agencies, whether it's funding organizations, whether it's the streets department, the buildings department, the planning department. They all have to begin to coordinate it. To get that little cluster to work together is, of course, an enormous challenge. So you can see the same problems that Will was talking about on a national scale playing themselves out even right down onto a municipal scale. So these challenges are huge, but they're not insurmountable. And I think with enough will, we can actually get moving, as we've seen in many cities around the world.
Thank you. Thank you. That is very inspiring and thought-provoking. Thank you for sharing that. Actually, there's a question also for you, Mark, that it's about data collection and gathering, which are central to an effective governance structure. But oftentimes the data are scattered and are collected by different institutions. So how do governance structures, a good governance structure would impact data collection, validation, and dissemination? So that would be done in a systematic way. And if you can just briefly, in 2 minutes, respond. Thank you.
Well, it depends on the data, obviously. The global climate model output from the international organizations is coordinated within the United States. And I think in the UK, it's the same, and in many countries. And they make it readily available. So the idea here is that we're all using the same data. Obviously, global climate models produce ridiculously differing results, particularly on the precipitation. If I just use Philadelphia, for example, we have 32 models. Almost all of them project intensifying rainfall, but some of them project lessening rainfall. So you've got all kinds of data problems associated with that. So the more that the federal government or the state government can organize and put their imprimatur on particular data sets, the better off we are. And the IPCC is, of course, a good source of that. And the National Weather Department and the National Aeronautics Organization within the United States, or in the UK, the Met Office. These are the organizations that collect the data. On a local scale, data becomes very, very difficult, particularly if you're trying to measure impacts, because it's collected by hundreds of people and hundreds of actors, non-governmental organizations, various departments, and the quality assurance is not always there. So one of the issues that we have to deal with is if we can't get well quality assured data, whether it's from a national organization, you've got to be very careful in how you use it. But I guess the short answer is the more that you can get information and data that's readily available from these national and international organizations, the more chance you'll have that it'll have the credibility when you take your results to the politicians or the decision makers.
Exactly. Data is a very important issue. So if we have reached the end of the session, we discussed and addressed some very important issues. If I would like to summarize, there are 4 key main steps in reaching a good governance structure that we discussed. The first one is setting a good objective, something that is endorsed by different stakeholders and would gain political will as a support for its implementation. But once all the different stakeholders, as Will mentioned, are in agreement with the objective and what needs to be done, then they will be also committed in implementing them. The second issue is to address the fragmented institutional arrangements. And we discussed that many times, and often there are different stakeholders that are involved in the governance of climate change and responding to climate change impacts. So a stakeholder mapping would be an excellent way to help to navigate the different players, and then also to set a standard for data collection and what are clear roles and responsibilities of each of these institutions. And the third option would be, of course, the cost recovery mechanisms, and to see that how the needed funding and budgetary resources will be supplied and secured to implement the needed climate change actions. And we learned that the cities that are already ahead, they are moving faster, they are securing resources, and perhaps we can learn from them. And finally, we would need to learn from the plans that we have implemented and continue monitoring and evaluation to learn from our own mistakes and then to do better. Now, by this, we have reached the end of the session. Let me once again thank you very much to our speakers who did a wonderful job sharing their experiences and then also sharing insights to the questions raised by the audience. Also, special thanks to Zeyu Yao, the reporter of this session. And I would like to once again invite all the participants to join the different sessions of the Asia Water Forum. Thank you very much, everyone. See you in the next sessions.